TJ Hawkinson, Dalton Kincaid, Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen. We have a ton of players on bye this week. It's actually going to be tough to submit starting lineups for quarterback and tight end. Hopefully this can help you out a bit. Starting off quarterback, usually it's like, oh yeah, super excited to play Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts quarterback won by about. Here it's a little bit tougher, right? I mean, you're going up against San Fran. You have an applied team total of 22.25 points. Now, we still got to rank the man at 1 based off what we've seen with rushing upside and how it is a straight up cheat code from a fantasy football perspective. Jalen Hurts averaging 23.5 points per game, by far and away higher than any other quarterback in fantasy that at least plays this week. So while we'll have him at 1, I do want to put a little asterisk. It's supposed to be a very tough game here against a great Niners defense. Now, Mahomes will come in at 2. With Mahomes, I understand he's been a little disappointing, right? I mean, right now he's averaging about 19 points per game, but he's still Patrick Mahomes. So you have an applied team total of 24 points for this offense in Kansas City. So I am not going to overthink it. I'm still going to have Mahomes here locked and loaded. CJ Stroud will be our QB3. Should be a pretty high-scoring game against the Denver Broncos if you look at the over-under. You actually have an applied team total of 25.25 points for the Texans here. That's higher than what you have in Philly. That's higher than what you have in KC. And CJ Stroud is averaging 20.3 points per game this season. He's averaging more points than Mahomes, and he has a higher implied team total this week. In reality, if you remove the names to these players, there's a chance that we should put CJ Stroud at 2, but I'm just not mentally tough enough to do that. Now, dropping down to our next tier, we're going to go Dak Prescott, who plays tonight against Seattle. Should be a blowout. I mean, right now you have about a 10-point spread on this game. You have a 28-point implied team total for Dak Prescott and the Dallas Cowboys. So they'll score a lot of points, right? It's just do they run the ball in the second half? But Dak is averaging about 20.5 points per game so far this season. And one thing that I'm very comfortable with is actually taking Dak Prescott to have more than half a total yard on Underdog Fantasy for tonight. And of course, if you want that pick'em over on Underdog, you can find that link in the description in the comment section. Promo code FLOCK, 100% a positive match, plus our rest of season fantasy football rankings and tiers. And that Dak Prescott special pick'em more than less than half a total yard. One other pick'em that may be interesting to look at would be Zach Moss for fewer than 97.5 total yards if you have the stones for it. But let's move down to our next guy, Justin Herbert at 5. With Herbert averaging about 20.5 points per game going up against New England, I mean, it's going to be a blowout. New England just can't effectively move the ball down the field. I mean, it's kind of crazy that Herbert has had his entire offense collapse all around him. Quentin Johnston is legitimately nothing. But he still shows up. He still performs every single week and still has been an elite level quarterback this season. We'll have Tua at 6. Now with Tua, he actually has the highest implied team total of any team in the NFL this week, almost at 30 points. Going up against Washington, it's about the best matchup you could ever ask for. But we've seen this time and time again with the Miami Dolphins. They will score a zillion points, but typically they're going to do that with actually running the football, where you have Tua only averaging about 17.5 points per game so far this season. But it is hard to get away from Tua based off the matchup that you have against Washington. Now, dropping down to our next tier, we're going to go Kyler Murray at 8. With Kyler, he has some rushing upside. I mean, the issue is, of course, you have an 18.5 point implied team total going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. So the Arizona Cardinals are supposed to be by far and away the worst offense out of anybody here ranked inside the top 9. But I'm willing to give Kyler just the benefit of the doubt from a fantasy perspective, given the fact that he can go out there and he can run the ball himself. Brock Purdy will be our next guy in here at 8. Purdy averaging about 18 points per game. You're going up against Philly. Typically, you'd say, okay, Philly has a tough defense, yada, yada, yada. Here, it has had zero impact on Brock Purdy's projection for this week, where right now you have the Niners projected for 25.25 points. So essentially, you have Vegas coming out saying, well, you know what? We are going to have a complete stomping here. The 49ers are winning this game. I mean, it's an aggressive statement. It is interesting. Obviously, Las Vegas sportsbooks know more than I do, know more than you do. So I think that we can probably start Purdy. And Lawrence will be our next quarterback in here at 9. You have an implied team total of only about 22.5 points. And the biggest concern is right now the Bengals project out to be the worst offense in the NFL this week. So if you have the Bengals as the worst offense in the NFL, I'm going to have a very tough time going through and looking at them. Just because you're most likely going to have them running the ball in the second half in comparison to some of these other quarterbacks. Like Sam Howell's probably going to have 50 passing attempts in this game against Miami right now. You do have a massive spread, 10-point spread on this game. So while you may get up to 40, 50 passing attempts for Sam Howell, who's leading the NFL in passing yards right now, obviously you have a good shot that you have turnovers, that Sam Howell is just disappointing all around. Now, Jared Goff will be our next guy in here at 11. With Goff, I mean, he's been stable. I understand that the Lions have been disappointing. The offense is great, right? Essentially, it's just, okay, are we going to have Jared Goff in a game where he has to throw the ball? You're going up against New Orleans, where New Orleans maybe has Chris Olave back. Maybe they don't. It seems like New Orleans is just getting devastated with injuries across the board. And this may be a spot where the Lions can run the ball in the second half. Jordan Love will be our next guy, averaging about 18 points per game, which is actually higher than what you have with Jared Goff. Going up against KC, the Chiefs have a great defense, right? You have an implied team total here for the Packers at 18.5 points, which is kind of surprising because I would assume that the spread here between the Packers and Chiefs would be massive, but it's only 5.5 points, so it should be, I mean, somewhat a competitive game. Russell Wilson will be our next guy near at 13. With Russ, I mean, the game right now projects to have very high over-under. But at the same time, I mean, you are looking at a quarterback only averaging about 16.5 points per game so far this season. And while the Denver Broncos have been much, much better, I mean, ultimately, this is a spot where they're just not letting Russell Wilson cook. Of course, I say that jokingly. They should not let Russ cook. They should keep him doing what he's doing. Now, Gardner Minshew here at 14 is someone that I actually kind of want to move a little higher than this. You have the implied team total the same as Denver. You have the implied team total at 21.75 points. I mean, going over and looking at those underdog pick'ems right now, like we said, I mean, they are very aggressive with Zach Moss at 97.5 total yards, where you have Gardner Minshew only at 5.5 rushing yards at 242.5 total yards. So they are kind of telling us Gardner Minshew's not going to really have any rushing upside. And maybe the Indianapolis Colts just look to continue to run the ball even with no JT. Now, dropping down to our next tier, we're going to go Baker Mayfield at 15. Now, the Bucs should probably win this game against Carolina, right? But the issue in terms of starting Baker Mayfield is this is probably a team that can look to run the ball in the second half, where right now Carolina is not allowing a ton of points to opposing wide receivers, to opposing quarterbacks, simply because teams don't have to get into shootouts. They don't have to throw the ball. Geno Smith will be our next guy here at 16. With Geno, he's averaging 13 points per game this season. Been very bad. It's a very bad matchup going up against Dallas. If you're desperate, you can start him. We'll go Derek Carr in here at 17. Derek Carr only averaging about 12 points per game. Carr's been horrendous. You do have an applied team total of 21 points for this offense. I don't know how. I guess it's just with how bad this Detroit Lions offense is becoming. But ultimately, going back to what we were saying previously, I mean, no Michael Thomas, possibly no Olave, possibly no Shaheed. Like, this is a Saints roster that is decimated top to bottom. And then Matthew Stafford will be our last quarterback in here. With Stafford, you have a respectable implied team total of 21.5 points. I mean, the matchup against Cleveland obviously does scare me a bit. Just ultimately, none of these quarterbacks really here in this last year have any type of rushing upside. And for one reason or another, you shouldn't be excited about either their offense or the matchup that they're in. Now, let's go over to tight end. Let's look at Travis Kelce. I understand Kelce hasn't necessarily been the same player that he has been in years past. He's 34 years old. Cut the man some slack. Ultimately, you're averaging 17 points per game, by far and away higher than any other tight end in fantasy that's playing this week. You're in your own tier. Now, dropping down to our next tier, we're going to go Sam Laporta. Sam Laporta averaging about 13 points per game, 25-point implied team total going up against the Saints. Should have a ton of points scored. Obviously, it's just, okay, are they going to be running it? How much of this offense will the two running backs and Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery take? But nonetheless, I don't think you need to be too worried about this Saints defense. Trey McBride will be our next guy in here at 3. Now, with McBride, we're going to have to monitor all the injuries that we have right now in Arizona. Because Arizona had no Trey McBride at practice on Wednesday. I believe had no Hollywood Brown, no Michael Wilson at practice on Wednesday. So maybe McBride, I don't know. I'm expecting McBride to play. I mean, the man's carrying this offense. So, I mean, give him a day off. Let him go out there and chill out in the ice tub on Wednesday. If you're looking at the per game statistics, obviously it's very skewed based off him not really having the role at the beginning of the season. Now, dropping down to our next tier, we're going to go George Kittle at 4. With Kittle, we are talking about him being that sell-high candidate with Deebo Samuel coming back in. Just looking at the historical splits with and without Deebo, George Kittle's a completely different player in games that no Deebo Samuel is in this offense. I mean, Kittle's going to be an elite level option. It's just tough, right? I mean, you're extremely volatile. You have a higher ceiling than pretty much everybody here not named Kelsey. Evan Ingram, I'd say almost the exact opposite. You have a higher floor than almost anybody here not named Travis Kelsey. But Evan Ingram continues to do absolutely nothing in the touchdown category. I mean, I would like to have Evan Ingram higher than this, if I'm going to be honest with you, just because the target volume is consistent, and we'd assume that at some point he begins scoring touchdowns. It's just difficult. I don't know if we can put him ahead of Kittle when he's only averaging about 10.5 points per game. Now, going over to our next tier, we're going to go David Njoku at 6. Njoku's very interesting. You have an implied team total of 18 points. I mean, this is an offense that is going to be very, very bad going up against the Los Angeles Rams. However, David Njoku 2 weeks ago saw 15 targets. David Njoku this past week saw either 8 or 9, so they are heavily involving him as a receiver here, and it makes sense given the decimation that they've had of this offense overall, and it's easy for the backup quarterback to just lean on a tight end that's going over the middle. Pat Freiermuth will be our next guy here at 7. I mean, with Freiermuth, I want to be a little bit hesitant in how we rank him, obviously, with this being his first good week all season. But it's a great matchup going up against Arizona, where you actually have a 23-point implied team total for the Steelers here, which is very rare. Usually the Steelers are way much lower than this. But ultimately, at the end of the day, Freiermuth is kind of one of the last guys we can rely on. I mean, I would say top 5 tight ends here, you feel very comfortable with. Behind this, I mean, all of them are going to be a little volatile. Like Dalton Schultz, I mean, did not practice today. Looks to be dealing with an injury. Really did not play much at all this past week. He was operating in a tight end by committee in Houston. So while I'm going to rank Dalton Schultz at 8, I do want to put a massive asterisk on this in that I have no idea, ladies and gentlemen, what to expect here. Like, I think we need to be monitoring the practice reports, and Dalton Schultz, if he's not at practice like on Thursday, he's probably going to move down these rankings dramatically. Now, Jake Ferguson will be our next tight end at 9. With Ferguson, I mean, Shoemaker is getting involved, so it's a little frustrating, right? I mean, if you had all the tight end volume, all the tight end production just being funneled through Jake Ferguson, I mean, you could comfortably start him as a top 5 option in fantasy. It's just tougher if they're going to start dispersing the ball around to a few more options in this offense. Dallas Goedert will be our next guy near at 10. With Goddard, I mean, I'd imagine they really want him in for this Niners game. I don't know if he's going to play. I probably doesn't. I just kind of wanted to rank him in a range where I would say, okay, if he does play, this is about where we put Dallas Goedert this week. Obviously, long-term, he'd be much higher than this when he is fully healthy, but it's hard to imagine him being fully healthy his first week in here. Now, Taysom Hill will be your next guy at 11. Now, with Taysom, it's interesting because typically it's almost impossible to project him and figure out what his volume's going to look like, yada, yada, yada. But, I mean, I don't know if you are looking at this New Orleans Saints offense, as we've discussed, everybody's out. Like, Taysom's one of the last guys standing. And it does seem like every direct snap to Taysom Hill, outside the fumble this past week, ends up being better than anything else they have going on with the traditional offense. So I don't know. Maybe we see some more Taysom Hill involved. Of course, non-PBR format, you bump up Taysom. Logan Thomas will be our next guy near 12. I mean, maybe you have 40, 50 passing attempts for Sam Howell. They're going to be in garbage time, second half. Maybe Thomas has involved. Going over to Higbee. I know Higbee's the hot name. Obviously scored multiple touchdowns this past week. Going up against Cleveland. Hate the matchup. You'd have a respectable implied team total, but still, I don't really know if we can be excited about starting Tyler Higbee. I'd much rather go with like Freiermuth off waivers. K-Dot will be our next guy near at 14, odd and averaging about 8.5 points per game. Going up against Carolina, what we were talking about previously, right? I mean, if you look at the passing volume allowed from this Carolina Panthers defense, it's not really there. And a big reason for this is the Panthers are never going to get into a shootout with anybody. You're never going to be having to go down there, drive the ball downfield in the last quarter of the game, just pass. No. It's probably going to be running the ball in the second half with Rashad White. Kyle Pitts will be our last guy here. And I would love to have Kyle Pitts higher than this, to be honest with you. But the issue is, while, yeah, Jonnu Smith's kind of being removed from this offense, if you look at his involvement, it's been a straight decline. Still, Kyle Pitts had 2 targets this past week. Like, Jonnu Smith played fewer snaps than he's played all month, and Kyle Pitts saw 2 targets with that being the situation. So at this point, it's hard to say that Kyle Pitts is anything more than a name, regardless of if we want to blame it on the coaching staff or whatever. But I think that should be it for these rankings. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. Of course, if you wanted to go out there, check out any of those pick'ems, take the fewer than 97.5 total yards for Zach Moss, or go with Dak Prescott to have more than half a total yard. You can find that on Underdog Fantasy. Promo code FLOCK, 100% deposit match, plus our rest of season fantasy football rankings and tiers. But thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. I really do appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day, and really hope we get to see you out with the live stream tomorrow night.